Again, I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Digital Economy Lunch Seminar. Today's speaker is Sandy Pentland, who came in from MIT. Sandy's the founder and director of the MIT Connection Science. He's been advisor to the OECD, the United Nations, the EU, Google, AT&T, a very long list, which would take the rest of the hour for me to list. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering and one of the most cited computational scientists in the world. For the seminar, we welcome and encourage questions. Let's try and focus on more sort of clarifying questions for the first 45 minutes, and then we'll have broader questions for the last 15 minutes or so. If you're at Stanford, just raise your hand. We'll call on you, or Sandy will call on you. If you're online, please use the Q&A function there in Zoom. I will look through those and periodically bundle them and ask Sandy. So with that, Sandy, you can now come to the podium and tell us about the emerging new economy and Web 3.0.
Right, so thank you. So the title is meant to provoke interest, and hopefully now I have to live up to the title, and we'll see how that goes. That's me, that's my email if you want to get in touch with me. And I wanted to say just a tiny bit about what I do. So people in academia are usually focused on problems that are best described as curiosity-driven. So Einstein, Bohr, all those sorts of things. And but there are other ways to think about it, and this is a diagram of practical versus need to understand. And one of the things that's really interesting is that there's a corner up there which you don't see all that often in academia because it's long-term, so you can't get an NSF grant at it. And industry typically doesn't like to support it because it's long-term. And it's something that looks at practical problems like infectious disease and asks, what are the basic science behind this, right? So it's trying to do sort of breakthrough type things or things that really change the set. And that's what I like to think that I'm doing. And the way I do that is a couple. First of all, pick a practical problem. The world is becoming digital. I mean, in all of your lifetimes, things have just changed dramatically every 5 years. Right? Web 1, Web 2, IoT, blah, blah, blah. It's crazy. And we see a lot of good things, but we see a lot of bad things too. And what we'd like to do, what I'd like to do is figure out how can we put things on the right path so it comes out good for everyone. Okay, so that's sort of my mission. And in that, we do a number of things. Some of the things are very practical. So for instance, we design software and make programming standards. And I'm on the IEEE committee for standards for this sort of thing. And in the last couple of years, we helped Swiss Post, Swisscom deploy a Web3 system called Swiss Trust Chain. So they're getting into this game of thinking about how do you exchange value without exchanging the data. That's sort of the basic theme there. And we worked with Fidelity Investments and the largest banks to spin up something called Akoya, which now handles 3/5 of all bank accounts in the United States and half of all credit cards. And what it does is it replaces the old system, which required when you moved money from one bank to another, they also shared all your personal data. And we got rid of that. Now they share attestations. It's like, yep, real person, that sort of thing, rather than giving people all the sort of raw data. You can look it up. And we've done some other things too, which are even larger scale. Like we've done experiments with various countries, Italy, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, South Australia, and now in the US too, looking at mobility data, government data, credit card data, health data, and asking what would you do if you could put them all together in a way that was safe? What's the upside from all this data, in other words, right? And I'll tell you a little bit about that. And as a part of that also, we do standards things and regulatory things. So I was involved at Davos, sorry? Okay, so you can't hear me. So for instance, I was involved in the World Economic Forum discussions around personal data that gave rise to GDPR. It was part of the people that formed the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this amusing club, which I'll mention later. So how many of you have heard of a Club de Madrid? Nobody. This is a small club, 120 people. It's all the former presidents and prime ministers in the world. How's that for an exclusive club? Right? And they have people like me to come and entertain them and talk about policy and stuff, and that's what I do. So those are some of the things of sort of who I am and where I come from. And recently, Eric has been talking about the idea that a lot of our systems are optimizing capital at the expense of labor. In other words, replacing labor. And that's sort of a natural thing to do. If you think about things in terms of capital all the time, and then you come to AI, well, what's the natural thing to do? You optimize the use of AI for capital. So it's expensive, labor, you replace it, right? But if you had a multi-dimensional thing where you were thinking about, well, I have to optimize, whatever that means, capital and labor, you'd come to something different. And this is, I think, Eric's point, is that you come to AI as a complement, something that made people smarter. And this is something I very much believe. And in fact, that's the IEEE thing that I'm co-chair of. Because you have to live in this world, and the fact that it makes more money doesn't necessarily benefit you or everybody. You'd like to have something that is a larger social solution. And that's the sort of theme that we do, is we look at much more sort of, well, I guess you can't see the top thing, well, whatever. We look at all the pieces that go into, for instance, ESG, and we ask, could we optimize them simultaneously? So not just money and not just environment, but also the social things. And obviously you have to weight these things and decide what you mean by optimum. And that's actually, in my view, a political decision. It's something that has to be discussed with society in general. But what we've done is we've built tools that let people do this. So for instance, for South Australia, we built a tool that helps small businesses not only select places where they would be successful, but places where they'll help the community most in terms of employment, in terms of ecological impact, and so on and so forth. And we're beginning to now deploy this here in the United States. We have a network of some 1,400 local banks. These are community banks that we're beginning to work with so that they can help small businesses in their community do a better job. We've also done those large country scale things. So this is the country of Senegal. And we had a big contest where we had hundreds of groups from around the world try to take anonymized aggregate data. So this data like census data, but not the normal census data. It also includes mobility. Where do people work? Where do they play? It included some aspects of spending. What sort of things do people spend? How much do they spend? And we asked, could we measure the sorts of things that are in the Sustainable Development Goals? And the answer is, you could actually do a really good job without spending a lot of money. Unlike the census, this data already exists. It's just locked up in telcos and banks and things like that. But if you can pry that free, you can do things that don't threaten individual, because it's aggregate on the census basis, but it allows you to tell where there are areas that are in poverty, what is the major inequality, public health, and so forth. And this allows you to, again, optimize all these measurements for the Sustainable Development Goals if you know how to weight them, which again is a sort of political thing. And this work was quite influential in my view. Personally, the Secretary General of the UN named me and a bunch of other people to be his data revolutionaries, which is sort of an amusing thing to do, to go into a very highly policed area. And they said, this guy with a machine gun says, and who are you? And I said, I'm a data revolutionary. right? No, really, they want me. But what we did is we came up with a framework for measuring these things, which is called the Tier 3 measurement frameworks in the Sustainable Development Goals. And some countries are actually doing this. And the census departments around the world are beginning to actually measure these things so that people can decide about the trade-off between these sorts of data. Right? As I said, it's sort of a political decision in my view. The problem with all this wonderful things that you can do, right, is that nobody's going to give you that data. So it's been extremely frustrating for me. We had this thing, we were going to help fix the world, blah, blah, blah. And all the companies and the governments are just holding on to their data and they don't want to give it to you. So how can you get the public good while still respecting their need for proprietary data and, of course, privacy as a fundamental? And that's really sort of the thing that we've been doing on our more practical side for a while. So we have a thing called open algorithms, which basically does a very simple thing. Instead of building a data lake, it sets up a question and answering system that asks questions of existing data. Right? So if you're a data owner, I don't ask you anymore, can you give me your data, for which the answer is usually no. I ask you, can you ask a couple of questions that don't threaten your proprietary values, don't threaten individual privacy, but will return to you some value. And so it's a question and answering system. And you see these now in a number of places around Silicon Valley called federated learning. Yeah.
Asked, and is there a danger of combinations of questions revealing information that wouldn't be revealed by any individual piece of?
Yeah, so you have to be careful about privacy and reveal. So for instance, differential privacy has buried in it the notion that you're only going to ask a couple of questions and your guarantees get weaker and weaker as you ask more. In terms of restriction, there are ways of doing this that are Turing complete. So that means that you don't have, you can't ask questions which threaten individual liberty or proprietary things, but you can compute anything. And what actually happens is something that's in between. Things that are efficient, answer all the questions you mostly care about, understandable, and have strong privacy. Won't call them guarantees, but because all these things are probabilistic, but are as privacy preserving as anything. So that's the part that's really exciting, is that suddenly these things have been developed. And it's one of the fastest growing areas of AI, federated learning. Google does this for on your phone with Swipe, the typing application. So the computation happens on your phone. It sends these encrypted statistics that even Google can't interpret, but they can combine this from hundreds of millions of phones and optimize the algorithm on average, send that back to all the phones, and now the phones can update themselves privately to do a better job. So your data never leaves the phone. Google doesn't know what you typed, but yet hundreds of millions of phones get updated with some frequency. Apple's working on this, other companies are working on it because it just makes sense. First of all, it's less communication, but it's also a lot more secure. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is what Akoya does. We worked with Eurostat and the EU presidency to make sure that Europe's on the path to doing this for its official statistics. And as I mentioned, Akoya now handles 3/5 of all US bank accounts and half of the credit cards. So it's actually getting out there, in addition to things that people like Google and Apple are doing. And the importance of this, of course, is that it maintains privacy. It also maintains privacy of proprietary data. So you can have companies contributing data. So this is tremendously important in health, where you have these drug companies that have disparate types of data. Maybe all of them have run some sort of Alzheimer's experiment, but they can't share the results of that because it's proprietary and it's against HIPAA. But they can share statistics about it using these sort of methods. And so they're gearing up to do that and are beginning to do it in little ways. But that would open up huge additional power in drug discovery. And of course, there's national security data, which is increasingly relevant, unfortunately. It's more secure because, first of all, it only transmits encrypted things. That's the little thing. The big thing is the data stays where it started. You don't have copies of data everywhere. That's the thing that really kills. And as we get into the world of IoT, what we're seeing is we're seeing more and more threats because there's more surface to threaten. And if you have data stores everywhere, people are just going to come in and begin stealing them. So you want to have the minimal number of data stores. You want to be carefully handled. There's more to say about this, and I will.
Well, actually, could you say a little bit more about that last point? When you say your data store, are you saying it's, I'm not sure what you were.
Oh, so imagine that, let's take the swipe thing for typing. So there's a copy of your typing on your phone. Let's imagine that all that data went to Google. So there'd be a big lake with all of your data. Well, that gives two good targets for bad guys to get at your data, right? And the more attractive one would be the central one. But the way they actually do it, the only place you can get at the data is on your phone. It's probably not worth the effort unless you're somebody really important. Right? So that's an example of it with the Alzheimer's thing. So you have this drug trial, and so far all of them have failed. But if you could put them together, you might be able to see patterns that would be very significant. But proprietary interest keeps that from happening. This is a path forward for doing that. Okay? So as Larry Lessig says, one of the more important things here is that this changes the way data is valued and used. Because what I just told you is you don't have to own the data or hold it even to use it. Right? That's really interesting.
We have a bunch of questions online. Do you want to take some now or just continue on ahead?
Oh, sure, yeah, if there's, I mean, maybe you could digest them.
I'll give you some of the more straightforward ones now. There's some really broad questions too that we can save a little bit. Are there any performance issues using federated data instead of traditional methods? From Mert Unver.
So some of the older ones, like the one that controls nuclear weapons in our country, have performance issues. They've gotten better over time. But some of them, like Swipe, are absurdly lightweight. In fact, they're much less costly than moving the data around. So there's a range of things. With Akoya, for instance, I would say it's more efficient all the way around. Yeah, so it varies on exactly what question is, but, and there is a trade-off. There's a trade-off between just how secure you want, what are the questions you're gonna ask, and the cost. But because
it could actually be less computation.
not just in principle, it's often less expensive, right? So that's pretty interesting. And one of the implications of this, using data without holding it, is that when I set up some sort of new application, let's take the Alzheimer's thing, I no longer have to go to all of the drug companies and say, will you give me your data? Because their answer is no. Right? They don't know what's going to happen with it. They don't know the result. But if you go to them and say, will you give me some statistics about your data? And if it turns out that there's some discovery, then you can share in whatever happens from that. They're much more positive about that because they know that it doesn't violate HIPAA. It's not a privacy thing. They know that you can't get all the details of what they did. You can prove these things, right, mathematically. But you have the option or the possibility of finding something wonderful. And even if it's not you that finds it, maybe you can get some participation in the eventual thing. So that idea that you can have data cooperatives that don't share data but just share insights is really changes the way you think about things completely. And that, to me, is one of the basic things about Web3. We'll get to that, okay? One of the things about having this type of system where you send questions and get back answers is I now have a log of all the questions that were asked and all the answers that were given. So I can do an audit of things at any one time, okay? And what this means is, to me, is that this is how you control AI. AI in general is just patterns and data. And if you can control what gets asked or see what gets asked and what happens as a consequence, then you can ask continuously, is it fair? Is it equitable? Is it what I wanted? Right? So you can have auditing systems. And I argue in something that I wrote for the Club de Madrid, all those uppy-ups, that what you really want to do now is you want to set up an auditing system for AI rather than try to a priori regulate it too much. Because we don't really understand where it's going. We don't really understand the things it's doing. So we need to build an evidence base so we know what to do. And that needs to be something that's not just, oh, we gave this person access to the data so they can do a study. It needs to be things that are regular systems that are audited continually. And I think if we had those sorts of systems, then we could begin really figuring out what to do about AI, where to use it, things like that, what was good, what was not good. So another sort of argument. We have done this with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank for Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, where we went in and we looked at their social support systems. So they give cash payments to young mothers every other week if the kids go to clinics regularly and go to school regularly. Most people support it. There were complaints that it was biased against rural people, against certain ethnic groups. So what we did is developed a tool that allowed them to audit their system. And the politicians, the regulators, could look at it and say, well, gosh, if we change the rule this way, what happens? Do we reach more people? Does it cost more? Are we more discriminatory over there? Because fundamentally, there's always trade-offs, and those trade-offs are a political decision. In Colombia, we found a really interesting thing, which was there were almost 1 million people that were not getting benefits that were supposed to, and there were about 1 million people who were getting benefits who were not supposed to get the benefits. And yes, what are they going to do? Because they can't go around and tell people, by the way, we're cutting you off. What they did is they changed the rules so that over time, they'll get back in whack, right? So that's an example of the sort of thing you need to do, to continually audit and change your policy to achieve the goals that you want. So we're familiar with these sorts of things. This is a distributed ownership platform, right? And actually, every time we use a credit card or GPay or Apple Pay, we're familiar with this. Because what happens is you go into a store, I'll take the physical version, and you present that card, which has a number, which is basically a routing number. And that routing number tells where to send the amount that you want to buy. And sometimes there's a code that says it's, you know, it's a essential versus non-essential, but it's not exactly what you bought. And so they take that, MasterCard, Visa takes that, and sends it to your bank. Now, MasterCard and Visa don't know what you bought, and they don't know about your bank account. And the bank doesn't know what you bought, just that you want to make payment for something. In fact, the bank doesn't know where you're spending your money, except in very general terms. All they do is they look at it and say, yep, this looks fine to me, thumbs up, and they send that, yes, that attestation back to the merchant. Merchant says, I don't know what the bank is, I don't know what your balance is, but I got the funds, thumbs up, I can now do it. Notice that the bank data never leaves the bank. The bank doesn't get to know much about the merchants or actually about you. So it's this anonymous routing system. And we use them all the time, all over the world. But now let's imagine that we also had health data. So did you get your vaccination? Well, instead of sending it to some state authority, you could send it to the place that you got vaccinated. And they could say, yep, or no. And because they already know that, right? It's not like you're giving them more information. And the people that transmit that information don't need to know what the answer is, nor do they need to know anything except where to route it. And you get the same sort of symmetry. You can also do the same thing for loans, et cetera, et cetera. And this is sort of fundamentally the way Akoya does it, right? It sends attestations to people. So what happens when you put all of this stuff together? Well, the buzz phrases for that are digital identity. And we've helped MasterCard with their digital identity solution, which has been deployed in Australia and Kenya and a couple places. It's basically this sort of system, right? It's just having the banks and other entities vouch for you when you need to be vouched for, right? And it's not in the control of the government, notice, right? It's in the control of all the places you shop and work. And all they get to see is they get questions occasionally. Well, that sounds pretty good. And if you believe McKinsey, that's going to add a lot to the overall GDP of the economy because there's less fraud, things are easier to do, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Yes.
Which brings to a question that's actually asked early on, but I think it's a good time to ask it now. Tatiana Yakushkina asks, what's your take on digital identity perspective in Web3? Are you more likely to see a universal standard like the World Wide Web Consortium or multiple ones inspired by different protocols?
Almost certainly you're going to see multiple ones. We had a small part to do with setting up India's Aadhaar system, which incidentally is not perfect. They could have done a better job. We told them and they ignored us. Other places are going to have protocols that are roughly like this, but they're not going to be uniform. So this is one of the things, is that digital identity is a highly political issue. Every country has different mores about privacy, about ownership, about what the state can and can't see. So what you need is something that's interoperable. And I'm going to get this a little wrong, but I think there's a standard for this that is used already internationally. I think it's called X509. It is a standard that says, okay, you got the thumbs up for this thing. What's the level of security? And they go out and they measure this. And this is used throughout the US government for security clearance, but it's also used for transference of funds and other things in many countries around the world. And so you can do the same thing with digital identity. And this happens in this country, and it happens with funds. It's where if I want to do something, they'll look at my X509 certificate, and they'll say, well, that's good enough for me, or I'm sorry, the place where you got that certification doesn't really measure up.
So like, yes, this is a real email address, or yes, I saw his passport and fingerprints in my print. Or
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So a question that I have about these things when we talk about this, and we will get to Web3, okay? I left that at the end, right? Is how do we avoid centralization? So Tim O'Reilly recently asked about Web3. Wait a second, isn't this just gonna go the way of Web 2 and Web 1 where there's a couple big players? And that is an issue. This notion of distributed data is all nice and good, but if there's a central big brother, you got a problem, right? So how do you deal with that? And I thought I needed to do that because Tim makes a lot of people notice what Tim says. And I think that the answer, and this is just a proposition, is to tie data control to community fiduciaries. So in the case of MasterCard and Visa, control of the data lies with the banks principally, right? And MasterCard and Visa can only see a little bit, and the merchants can only see a little bit. And unless the banks merge, they can't see each other's data. Imagine that you had local entities, political entities, maybe they're co-ops, maybe they're administrative regions. In the UK, they're called councils, little elected groupings for each neighborhood that decide about policy and housing and stuff. And this is not unfamiliar in America too. So we have had these notions of co-ops that are fiduciaries. They act for you for a century and a half at least. So the community banks in the 1870s. So right after the Civil War, some of the East Coast banks were huge. They controlled everything. They pushed everybody around. And so what communities did is they formed agricultural banks and later other sorts of regional banks to be able to push back. There was some chaos. You're probably all familiar with that. But in the end, what you got was a distributed banking system with uniform controls, general controls imposed by the feds. Rural electrification. Turns out that 56% of all the electric grid in the United States was not built by big companies or by the government. It was built by co-ops. So these communities said, well, wait a second, we're not getting any electricity. And they pooled their money and their effort, and they built the grid. They're pretty amazing. Those are still around, incidentally. And so my view is that we ought to have a same type of thing in this country, sort of data unions, data co-ops, things like that, to act as fiduciaries for your data so that you don't have to answer all these questions. You got smart people trying to protect you. But also, if they're local, it's very hard to centralize them. They don't want to be bought. They represent the people in this neighborhood. Now, you can get around that in various ways, but it takes usually decades. So like, for instance, a lot of the credit unions now are really huge. They used to be, only 30 years ago, quite small. They would represent a particular company, workers in a particular company or a particular neighborhood. And as long as that maintains, it's very hard to centralize it because you have this distributed control of the data. Okay? So we have an effort with the California law and of all places in North Dakota. It's a very, very advanced state in many ways. It's surprising to be able to enable these sorts of things to really work and protect people and represent people. So if you go to law.mit.edu, you can see some of what we do. It works with Codex here at Stanford, but it's not at all hopeless. Anyhow, this gets to Web3 finally. So I talked about this sort of way of handling data that's encrypted, where you only get to know the things you need to know. And so I think there's a version of Web3 which I'm seeing come up, which is not the crypto dreams of Ethereum or other sorts of things. These are like big companies and governments saying, we need a more secure distributed system where things that are supposed to happen automatically, where we can show compliance to the law because it's built in. And what do those look like? Well, you have these encrypted paths for moving answers around, value. You have smart contracts, little programs that live on top of them, that if I pay you something for something, this payment automatically by itself pays the tax on it. Government people like this, right? And of course, it's enforceable. You can look at it and say, here's the actual payments that happen. Now, Estonia has had a system like this for some 20 odd years. And you might think, oh my God, this sounds like Big Brother. But actually, people love it because you can see what the government has done to you and what you did back to the government. So there's never any argument, well, you didn't pay that, because you can show it right there. And in fact, actually, an interesting little factoid is when Estonia put this in for their VAT and other tax payments went up by 14%. So it's sort of interesting, right? Anyway, so companies are building these things, but let me first talk about something you might not know about, which is countries are building these things. So we helped Switzerland set up something called Swiss Trust Chain, which is just like the Ethereum platform, except highly efficient, essentially controlled or certified by the government. It actually is run by Swiss Post and Swisscom, which are sort of semi-private organizations. And it's for moving digital assets around, including money, including medical data, including payments of various sorts. Pretty cool. And we help them with the finance and the financial elements of that. More interesting is over the last 6 years, Singapore has developed such a system. And it wasn't Singapore, the nation, that developed it. It was their sovereign wealth fund. So their sovereign wealth fund has about $500 billion of investment in the Indo-Pacific, mostly banks and telcos. And they developed this Web3 system for shipping, for payments, for all sorts of things that would happen among their banks and their telcos. And they've looked at digital currencies and things like that and compatibility. And you might ask, why did they do that? And incidentally, JP Morgan paid for part of this too. So it's not just Singapore, okay? Why would they do this? Well, the reason is that China has an operational one. They have been trialing it for the last 5 years. They have a beta, right, up and running. The beta has about 200 million people using it regularly. This is not the digital currency. Digital currencies run on these things, right? This is the thing that coordinate data transfer within cities, for logistics, for all sorts of things, right? And they're very open about the fact that what they want to do is move this to all their Belt and Road properties. So there's $1 trillion worth of ports and rails and so forth that would then run on this sort of rail, right? Now, that's pretty interesting when people like that get in there. Why would they get in there? Well, I've talked about sort of inherent security, about conformance to local laws, which are not necessarily our laws, it's their laws. But there's a bunch of things you could begin doing. Like, for instance, this is actually based, I think, on Ethereum, but they sold this building to small people with tokens, you know, so you could just buy a piece of the building. So this is an NFT that actually corresponds to real estate, 120 million bucks. It's in Switzerland, pretty good. The one I like is this one.
They bought the building?
Yeah.
Like the title.
They got a consortium that bought the building. So this is like a decentralized autonomous organization, except that it's not quite, because it still has humans. It's more like a sort of cross between a DAO and an LLC, okay? So it's a limited liability corporation, but the administration of it happens automatically through smart contracts.
Some kind of a voting or governance rule in the DAO about when decisions have to be made, like.
And that's in the software.
Yeah, and then there's like people who have tokens have some rights to make decisions.
Yeah, and there's a governing board that have rights also. This is more interesting. So this is in Pakistan, where they have problems with corruption, all sorts of things, right? This was the Chinese system. What they did is they did a raise of almost $1 billion by selling tokens to people in this one particular area of Pakistan. And the tokens give you rights to electricity in the future. And they used the money that they raised to build a hydroelectric dam, and now people can cash in their tokens for electricity. And the economics of this are actually very positive, much more positive than if you had to do it in the traditional financing way. And the interesting thing is that this is structured, again, as sort of this DAO/LLC, which has over 1 million limited partners. So I don't know how many of you have ever set up an LLC or a fund or something like that. Having the idea of 1 million partners, limited partners, is crazy. Usually it's like 10, because the paperwork just goes exponentially. But since it's all software, you can do that. Pretty interesting, right? So that opens up the possibility of doing really, really interesting things in a way that is very resistant to corruption, which is very much cheaper than the normal way, using these sort of platforms. So we have multiple competing national 3.0 platforms, all with different legal frameworks. So fraud, data ownership is handled differently. The platform is actually an extension of national power. So we've seen this in Ukraine, right? What did the US do? The US said to Russia, okay, you know that money you had? You don't own it anymore because we own the rails. Okay? If you don't own the rails, you don't own the money. If you don't own the rails, you can't manage your trade. Right? So it really is. And as, let's see if we can get G said. So what G said is, you know, he who has the data has the initiative. Exactly right. So it's something to think about. So here we have nation states developing Web3 platforms for national power to ensure that their trade network and their payment networks are safe from sanctions and other things. And incidentally, they get to see the data more or less. Right? In China, it's more. In Switzerland, it's less. Right? And I ran a session on.
So on that point in particular, how is that different, or is it meant to be the same as a centralized platform where somebody controls it? I mean, it sounds like it's vulnerable to the same kind of central.
So the typical way you would send this up, right? Let's take Singapore as an example. So you have these different nation states which are not going to let their data leave their shores, okay? And you have companies which are not going to let their data leave their shores. But if they answer certain questions in a way that is, quote unquote, provably or auditably correct, right? Then what you end up with is a system where you have multiple ledgers, one owned by each company or participant, with standardized ways of updating the ledger. And they can now be checked to see that they're doing the right thing. This is important for certain sorts of fraud, where there's collusion among people also. So just like in the 1500s, you had dual ledger accounting. This is multiple ledger accounting, okay? Now, the difference is, let's take the extreme difference. The extreme difference is when China sets up something like this, you have an encryption key, but the Chinese government has an encryption key also, okay? Whereas Swiss, they don't have a key, just you. Okay, so it's a question of like, who gets to see the data? And let's imagine that there is fraud, okay? How do you make claims, legal claims? Okay, it's going to be different if it's the Swiss network versus the Chinese network versus the Singapore network.
So is what you're saying that sometimes the platform is an extension of national power and sometimes it's not, depending on what the rules are? Or is the idea that these platforms, that the country that sets them up would be able to do what the United States and the Western powers did to Russia with this kind of
So
platform?
platforms like this are always an extension of national power, right? And the United States has been very comfortable for a long time at being the reserve currency and owning the rails, right? And we've been using those recently, right? And it's not just people like China and Russia that are upset. If you talk to senior people in Germany, they're really upset too, because they're saying, my God, you know, the rules are not the rules. So they're very interested in having something where they control the rails, right? They can insulate.
So how is that different than the pre-Web 3.0 system?
First of all, your data doesn't leave your country or your whatever,
But,
okay?
But on that point of that the country that controls it still has that power.
So what sanctions are, we can see everything you do because we control the rails. And we're going to say, no, you can't do those things. It's like adding a new smart contract
You
to it.
still do that in Web 3.0.
The Swiss could do that, two things that they controlled. And they would lose all their business immediately because it would move to Singapore, okay? The difference is now you can't move anywhere because the American rails are it.
So it's a matter of having multiple different platforms as opposed to one platform.
Yeah. So what you're going to see on.
Is that a Web 3.0 thing, or is that having multiple platforms thing, or is it both?
It's both in my mind, right? Partially it's multiple platforms, right? So that you have choices about how to do things,
We had multiple SWIFT systems.
for instance.
That
Right?
would,
That would solve about half the problem, right? But if I can see things that are happening in the logistics chain, that's just as important as controlling the currency. Okay, because I could add things to it that say, oh, we're going to change the tax structure now, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I can use that data to front run you, right? Things like that. And then what happens when there's a dispute? Who resolves this dispute? If you own the rails, you're the one that gets to solve this dispute. So you don't want people to see the data because they can front run you and do all sorts of things to you, right? And you don't want that ownership of the rails to be something you're constrained to. So you'd like to have something that has no one entity can control it. So I don't know what the answer to this is. I mean, I have suggestions of what the answer is. You're going to have these multiple platforms. You need to have rules of the road that are common across the platforms, right? For dispute resolution, for visibility. I ran a discussion group with the World Leadership Alliance. 2/3 of the leaders thought that this was the most important issue around digitization and all of the issues of privacy, cybersecurity, et cetera, is governance. Who runs it? What are the rules? And I have a meeting on the 27th of high-level representatives of a bunch of countries to do something that we're calling the digital Bretton Woods, which is to try and set up governance rules that are of the willing, obviously. And we have a nod from the head of the World Bank saying, if you can get enough people to sign up to this, we'll actually have something called that, right? Which is pretty amazing, because we need to have rules about this so that there's uniformity, so that if you don't like some actor, you can plausibly move to another actor. I think that's what most of the world wants. It's not something that the US would be real happy about, because of course the US wants to maintain its monopoly on a lot of these things. But I think that time has left. So one of the things that the US needs to do, my view again, is have a champion in this game. You notice I talked about China and Singapore and Switzerland, but I didn't talk about the US. There is no champion. I mean, it's probably not going to be Meta. Who would trust them? Ethereum, maybe, but it's got to change the way it operates radically. Swift, well, they're building a blockchain system, but it's still going to be the Swift system. CBDCs, stable coins, those are all things that run on these rails. They're value tokens. They have a lot of the same problems of monopoly that say Swift has, and what you'd like to have. We think the sort of thing that we call trade coin, which is essentially a basket of assets that can be much more flexible and much more insulated from political power, might be a way to do it. We work with Maersk. Maersk is interesting. They have a blockchain system developed by IBM. I believe they run most of their Indo-Pacific shipping, all those containers, on this blockchain system. And they have promoted a standard for customs duty that most of the countries in the Indo-Pacific accept. Indo-Pacific, of course, is the fastest growing part of the world. It's the largest trade zone. And so this matters. And what we're doing is working with them to add in letters of credit and payment systems so that you'll have a full loop sort of system that is independent of these other systems, but has real buy-in, really official buy-in and regulation from all the countries that they participate with in the Indo-Pacific. So that's an example of something that would be a multiple participant, multiple ledger type of a system. Anyway, we're having discussions about this. We're going to do one at MIT on the 29th of June. We're going to do one out here at the Battery on October 6th. And we hope to do one at Davos. This is our picture of our thing we do at Davos with the Tatas. This is 50,000 square foot dome where everybody gets together and talks about stuff. And we're going to hear what people are doing in this area. and learn and hopefully influence people. So all this stuff is my opinion. It's not God's truth, right? But people find this really sort of compelling because they haven't really thought about it from this international power perspective. And a lot of the noise from the crypto community has sort of obscured some of the real solid aspects of this Web3 thing. And by insulating or thinking about this as a purely IT digital system, you lose the power of law and the power of governance to make sure that it stays decentralized. So like Tim O'Reilly's comments are absolutely true, but there are political ways of solving this problem. And we have examples of them. So it's not craziness. And I can tell you about different sorts of people that are interested. So these are some of the books that are more about building a data ecology. The newest one is Building the New Economy, which is sort of an argument for these data co-ops and how you would put them in charge of the data economy and the general economy. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Sandy.
How did I do? A little bit long, sorry.
We have about, 7 or 8 minutes. So first, if there's anyone in the room who has a question, right away, can we get a mic or just Megan? There are quite a few online too, but let's give people room first.
Yeah, thanks very much for a very nice talk. Just have a question. I think you briefly mentioned that, but I feel like with all those decentralized transaction platforms, it might reduce the power of some actors like the US. What is the incentive for a country is now the leader of the world to sort of lose a bit of its way to set the rules of the world? Why, yeah, what's the incentive for the US to implement those?
Well, the incentive is, I think, that there's a lot of countries that are willing to be part of a system. For instance, the EU, the Five Eyes, people like that. And a system like this would be much stronger if it had multiple countries really signing on to be part of it. Well, the US is going to tend to dominate that anyhow, just because its economy is large and the policy speaks with a single voice, unlike the EU, which tends to speak with many voices. So it wouldn't immediately be to the detriment of the United States. It would possibly be to its benefit to have this very distributed, secure, cooperative thing with uniform rules. So this is like the WTO revisited, right? So we all know that the World Trade Organization and things like that are not working really well. Even the World Trade Organization and the World Bank understand that. So this is actually an opportunity to rewrite those rules in ways that make a little more sense and which don't have some of the restrictions of paper and time and things like that. And that's actually sort of how I got into this. I said, look, these big institutions are just not working really well. The more you know about them, the more you know they're not working well. But we have the ability to make these sort of largely software systems, since most things are happening on digital rails, that would be empowering decision makers, the polity, to be able to have rules that are much more understandable and which can be monitored. So we have the ability to sort of reboot these international organizations. And I, of course, my pay grade is not enough to be able to comment about exactly how to do that. But there's a realization in the UN, in the World Bank, in places like that, that they need some sort of reboot and answer for the fact that so much of this is now happening in software. And the answer can't be take it out of software, because that's not working.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you about, so in principle, there is a design spectrum, and it seemed like you focused on one end, which I found very interesting, of like how could you design a decentralized smart contract capable transaction platform or blockchain? your end was kind of the rather centralized, probably government licensed type of blockchain where the government might have the ability to update the protocol, to not reveal certain parts of the transactions, keep them private to itself, and censor participants. And on the other end, you might have something that is probably as decentralized as it gets, like Bitcoin, where it is you're facing a very hard coordination problem to update anything, and one that is maybe too large for even a government. But then, of course, this has downsides. As you said, you mentioned transaction costs. I think you pointed out that that is a problem, like efficiency of transactions with these very decentralized systems.
And there are ways of fixing that.
But there is, exactly. And so there's a design spectrum, and there are advantages to both sides. And I was interested to see that you mostly saw potential, or like you seem to mostly believe that there will be a evolution towards decentralized systems at the government level that are going to
Well, no, so I wouldn't say,
award large controls to
yeah. So I don't think of them as centralized because they're multiple nations, multiple political systems, but they're not fully decentralized the way, say, Ethereum is, okay? And I emphasize the more government community-run version of decentralization because people aren't aware that that's even a possibility, okay? And I know people like Gary Gensler. You're going to have know your customer and anti-money laundering stuff in any system. It's just not going to be that way. So you can't get the extreme on the libertarian side, which I think is a beautiful dream, but and it's not going to happen. And it's probably good because there really are bad actors in the world, right? And on the other hand, I don't like the thing where the government owns the rails. I think that's really bad. So I'd like to have a multiplicity of things that follow certain guidelines. Like if you cheat me, I ought to have recourse in a legal system, and it ought to be accurate, fast, fair recompense, right? Okay, well, you don't like the way it is today. I don't like the way it is today. We have the ability to rewrite that. This is like the first time in centuries we've had the ability to do that. I was advisor to the American Bar Association. Their big thing is access to justice. Not even close. I'm sorry, right? If you have to hire somebody at hundreds of dollars an hour to even get into the court to blah, 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 that's not access to justice. We could design systems that advocate for individuals much more effectively. Let's do that, okay? And it's way above my pay grade to say where on that spectrum you want to be, but people need to know that there is another end of the spectrum, and it's not just the libertarian synonymous identity end of things. And you should know that for two reasons. One is because I think that we might want designs that are somewhere in the middle, but also because countries are building ones that are probably much too controlled by the nation for your taste. So you want to pay attention to that because
absolutely, yeah,
lots of things might depend on that. Right?
But even I really appreciate the perspective from the government, nation, state actors, and even there, I think there is a lot of advantages. Like having a lot of control can be a liability. I think the US has enjoyed a lot of power, but I think the reason why they were able to enjoy that power versus some more authoritarian states was precisely because there was a semblance of rule of law, or there still is, right? And so like even foreign companies would enjoy it to be listed on US exchanges, not just because that's where the capital is, but that's also where contractual security is. And now in a time where this kind of power becomes more weaponized, I think if you want to attract foreign and even national, and not lose national businesses, there can be a lot of benefit to designing a system where you give up certain types of controls to, for example, possess capital that you don't actually own. You might want to have the ability to like follow up on crime in some ways, but maybe you do not want to have complete control.
So, I mean, one of the things that people, I think, don't appreciate, and you really can't appreciate, is how bad things are today, right? Because we don't have an accounting of everything that happens. You know, I was talking about how you keep AI sort of honest by keeping track of everything that it does. It's really difficult to figure out what a judge does. It's really difficult to figure out a lot of these things that are going wrong just because there's not any data and you don't have access to it. Maybe we could make something that's a much more transparent society where the decisions are actually logged. So you can say, wait a second, this is not right. I mean, I remember I was at Oxford talking about privacy, and a very strong privacy advocate got up and said, we can't allow any AI because look at the bad things that it can happen, right? And the Kenyan justice minister got up and said, maybe you're right about all of these things, but have you seen the current system? Almost anything would be better. So, you know, maybe that's not the way it is here, but it's not perfect.
So I'm very sorry we're out of time. I know there's more questions. There are a lot more questions online as well, which we will pass on to Sandy. Thank you so much for joining us today. That was terrific. And I'm glad you're going to be with us in the fall. So we'll probably have more chances to interact with Sandy in the coming months. And that concludes the Digital Economy Lunch seminar series for the spring. We welcome your comments and suggestions of people you'd like to have join us for the fall seminar series. But thanks for joining us today and all semester, all quarter long. Thanks very much.